I went in just to warm up. I came out different. I don't know if it was the cold that went away or if it was me who went through something that I can no longer pretend didn't happen. Sometimes the wrong place finds you at the right time, and you can never call it an accident again. When the store lights started to dim, I should have left. I knew it. My feet knew it. But there's a difference between knowing and doing, and tonight I learned where that line is. If you've ever stayed in a place longer than you needed to, just because something there held you back, namelessly, you'll understand every second of this. Subscribe and stay. Tell me in the comments, where are you hearing this story from right now? The cold in Portland in November doesn't ask permission. It seeps into the seams of your coat, creeps up your wrist, and settles in. I'd been walking along Burnside for about 20 minutes without a real destination, the kind of walk you take when you don't want to stay stuck in your apartment anymore, but you also don't know exactly what you're looking for out there. The doorbell above the bookstore was the only sound I heard clearly all day. I went in without thinking. That's the simple truth. I went in because the wind had shifted and hit me right in the face at that moment, and the door was there, and there was yellow light leaking through the window. And my body made a decision that my head hadn't even processed in time to veto. The shop smelled of old paper and something slightly citrusy. Orange, perhaps. Or someone's tea, left open on some shelf. Jazz was playing from a speaker that was too small to sound very good. And the lights were the kind that make everything seem a little more intimate than it should be. I wasn't going to buy any books. I knew this from the very first step. But I stood near the literary fiction section pretending to read the spines with that intense attention we put on when we don't want to appear as we are someone who only went in to avoid feeling the cold. There were perhaps 4 people in the store. An older woman with a wet umbrella on her knee. A woman with headphones leafing through some photography book. A child shuffling among the comic books in the back. And it was her. But I still didn't know it was her. At that point, she was just a voice. Someone who said something to the cashier about a newly released edition, with the naturalness of someone who knows the place like the back of their hand. A voice a little quieter than the surroundings. The kind that doesn't try to be heard but is. I didn't turn around to look. I'm not sure why. I rested my finger on the spine of a book I hadn't read, and for a second the jazz stopped between tracks, and in the silence I heard her give a small laugh at something the attendant said. And something, it was simpler and stranger than that. It was the feeling that the room had become slightly smaller than it was a second ago. I hadn't turned around yet. I remained there, feigning concentration on spines I wasn't reading, but now a new awareness had settled into my field of perception. It was like when you enter a dark room and, even without seeing anything, you know there's a table there, your body knows before your eyes. When I finally made my way through this section, it was because of a book. I swear it was. It had a blue cover in a specific shade, that kind of faded blue that looks like it's absorbed a lot of rain. And the title was something about houses and what remains of them. I reached for it, and she was on the other side of the shelf. Not on my side, on the other. With his finger on another book, in a position mirrored from mine, so casual that for a second I didn't understand what was happening. She peered through the space between the books. Her eyes passed over mine, not quickly, not slowly. At the exact speed of someone who has seen you before and still hasn't decided what to do with it. This whole collection is good, she said. Not for me specifically. For the space between us. I said something. I don't remember what. Something that sounded like agreement, I hope. She smiled at the book she was holding and continued walking through the store. I stood still. Not in a dramatic way, in a very ordinary way. The way we feel when our bodies process something before our minds and need an extra second to catch up. I kept looking at the blue book in my hand without seeing the blue book in my hand. She wore a faded moss-colored coat. Her hair looked like it had dried without any particular intention, not unkempt, just free. A single earring on her left side, small, but the kind of thing you notice because you want to notice it. I realized I had noticed all of this in a fraction of a second and didn't quite know what to do with that information. I put the blue book back on the shelf. I went to the poetry section, because the poetry section was on the opposite side of the store, and sometimes you need distance to understand why you were walking away. The kind where you feel ridiculous when you realize your breathing is slightly quickened because of exchanging glances across the shelves with a stranger in a Portland bookstore on a Thursday night. That's such a specific phrase that it shouldn't mean anything. I picked up a book by Mary Oliver. I didn't choose it. It was the first one I could find at eye level, and my hand needed something to hold while I tried to readjust. The texture of the cover paper was slightly rough. That feeling was the most real thing in that moment. I heard her footsteps before I sensed her presence. Not hurried, not hesitant. The footsteps of someone who knows where she's going but isn't in a hurry to get there. She stopped at the entrance to the hallway. "Mary Oliver," she said, as if recognizing an old acquaintance. "A good choice for a cold night." I said I was just looking. She said that was fine, the store was good for that. And then she went into the hallway. The space was narrow enough that passing each other would have required one of us to step back slightly. Neither of us did. We stayed at a distance that wasn't uncomfortable, but also wasn't the distance strangers usually keep. She was reaching for something on a higher shelf. She stretched out her arm. Her coat rode up a little, and I saw her wrist for a second. I'm not saying it was her pulse that did anything. I'm saying that I noticed her pulse, and that I'm noticing my own breathing at this moment as I describe this to you, which already says something. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked without looking at me. And I meant to say, I wasn't looking for anything. But what came out was, "I don't think so yet." She lowered her arm, a thin book in her hand. She looked at me this time, really looked. "This place has a way of holding us back," she said. He smiled. He left the hallway. And I was left with Mary Oliver in my hand and my chest. I only bought it because it gave me an excuse to stay a little longer without it seeming like that's what I was doing. She sat down on the other stool. There wasn't a third stool. There wasn't another obvious option. She arrived, looked at the available space, glanced at me as if checking if the space was occupied in some way other than physically, and sat down. "I also got the tea," she said, as if this were a continuation of a conversation that had never formally begun. "It's good," I said, even though I hadn't had a drink yet. She gave a small laugh. "You haven't even tried it yet." I tried it. It was good. Chamomile with something that had honey in it, or it was just sweet in a way that tasted like honey. We were silent for a moment, which wasn't uncomfortable. The store had become quieter. The older woman with the umbrella had left, as had the woman with the headphones. There was a student in the corner with a laptop, and the child with the comics had left with the woman I assumed was his mother. "Do you come here often?" she asked. "First time. I went in because of the cold. Most of the best things start like this," she said, by accident, over a simple excuse. I wanted to ask what she meant by that. I didn't ask. Her name was Nora. I knew because the clerk called her name when she brought the book. Nora had reserved an edition of something whose full title I didn't catch because when I heard her name, the title ceased to matter. "Nora," she thanked me. She turned back to me as if nothing had happened. "Do you live here?" she asked. "2 years ago. It seems like he's still getting used to it." I said maybe. She said Portland does that to people. It takes a while to reveal the places that matter. "This store, for example," she said. "Most people walk past it without going in. But you came in," I said. She looked at me in a way that I was still trying to name when I went because I needed a second. Not because I needed the bathroom. I went to wash my hands under the cold water and looked in the mirror as if checking if I was still the same person who entered the establishment 40 minutes ago. I was different. Not in a way that showed in the mirror. In an internal way, as if something had been slightly rearranged without my permission. I knew what it was. I didn't want to know. But I did. There was a woman outside on a bookstore stool, wearing a moss-colored coat and a single earring and a way of being quiet that seemed more intentional than most people's noise. And I was hiding in the bathroom because sitting next to her any longer seemed both the thing I most wanted to do and the thing I least knew how to do. This is recognition. It may not seem like much, but it is. Because I had spent a considerable amount of my life being very good at not recognizing it. I watched my hands drying on the paper towel. I thought, you can leave now. Grab your coat, say it was a pleasure meeting you, and go out into the cold. Tomorrow will be just another Thursday that happened once. A bookstore, tea, a stranger with good taste in poetry. I thought, this is the sensible plan. I threw the paper towel away. Opened the door. She was exactly where I had left her, only now with the book open in her hand, reading with that quiet attention that some people have, the kind of attention that makes you want to know what they're reading, not out of literary curiosity, but because you want to enter the same world but their mind is inhabiting now. She looked up when I approached, as if she had been expecting it, but not in a way that created an obligation. I sat back down on the stool. I didn't say anything for a moment. She didn't either. And in that silence there was a whole question that neither of us had asked yet. And I didn't know if I was ready to hear the answer, but I certainly was. She closed the book, marking the page with her thumb, not with a bookmark, but with her thumb, as if intending to return. She looked out the window. Outside, the cold continued doing what cold weather does, fogging the glass from the bottom up. Another 30 minutes of cold avoided, she said. Less, I corrected. She looked at me. Do you want to leave? It was a simple question. It was the most direct question anyone had asked me in a long time. And I still don't even know if she meant what I heard in it. But I heard something beyond what was on the surface, something that asked not only about the store, but about the entire state we had unnamed in the last 40 minutes. No, I said. Simple as that? She didn't smile broadly. She smiled in a restrained way, like someone keeping most of it to herself. We stared ahead for a moment. The jazz had stopped a while ago, and now something slower, quieter was playing, the kind of music one chooses when they want people to slow down. Our elbows were almost touching on the counter. Almost. I was aware of this almost in a way that was almost unbearable. She said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. Why did you really stay? And I knew the answer. I knew it completely. It was right there at the tip of a sentence I could have said, all of it, without embellishment. But there's a difference between knowing something and being able to tell it to a stranger on a bookstore bench while the clerk starts dimming the lights in the window display. So what I said was, I don't know, but I don't regret it. She looked at me for a second that felt long in the way that only specific seconds can feel long. Me neither, she said, And then the attendant said they were closing in 15 minutes, and the spell broke in a very gentle and very merciless way at the same time. And I picked up my empty cup and she opened the book again and she put the book down. She looked at me with an almost physical attention, the kind you feel in your chest before you process it with your eyes. "You can," she said. And then I opened my mouth, and then I knew exactly what I was going to say. And then I didn't say, not because I didn't want to. Not because I was afraid, exactly. It was more like, there's a moment before words where you can still choose to keep something just for yourself. Where you can still keep something intact before putting it out into the world, because once you say it, it exists in a different way. It becomes something else. It becomes subject to being answered, or not answered, or answered in a way you weren't ready to receive. What I was about to say was simple. It was true. And it would have changed the rest of the night in ways I couldn't have predicted. So what I said instead was, "Thank you for the company." She stood still for a second. A second that was long enough for me to know she had sensed the space where the sentence should have been. I wasn't mistaken in thinking I had slipped through the gap unnoticed. "It was good," she said, slowly. "The company." The attendant turned off another light. We stood up at the same time. She tucked the book under her arm. I picked up my bag. We walked side by side to the door, and there was something ceremonious about that walk that neither of us commented on, because commenting would have diminished it. She stopped as she was leaving. "Will you come back here?" "I don't know," I said. "True." She nodded slowly. She opened her mouth. She closed it. And then he said, "You were going to say something else earlier." I know it was something else. It wasn't a question. I looked at her. The streetlight streamed in sideways through the glass door and fell on the side of her face in a way that, at that moment, seemed almost... I didn't know which direction I was coming from. It didn't matter. She said it would be fine, that she had a way home anyway. She told me to be careful. I said you too. This kind of exchange is perfectly adequate and at the same time not at all what you wanted to be the last thing said. She left. I went. I walked a couple of blocks before stopping near a pharmacy window that was already closed. Not because I needed to stop. Just because my body decided it was a good time to process what had happened. And sometimes the body is more honest about these needs than we'd like. I hadn't asked for her number. She hadn't asked for mine. Neither of us had suggested that this was a possibility. Although neither of us had suggested that it wasn't. We had simply left, as if what had happened inside was complete in itself and didn't need continuation. As if it were something that existed for exactly the time it lasted, and that was it. But it didn't seem ready. It seemed interrupted in a way that was very different from complete. I walked to my apartment. I didn't take longer than I should have. I didn't go back to the bookstore. That would have been too theatrical. And I was trying not to be theatrical about something I didn't even know how to name. At home, I took off my coat. I put water on to boil, unintentionally tea. I stood in the kitchen with my hands on the cold counter and thought about the way she had said you were going to say something else with such certainty. She was right. And she had left room for that, not as a demand, but as recognition. She was saying, "I know." She was saying, "I saw." She was saying something to me with that phrase that I hadn't been able to say with mine. I turned off the stove before it boiled. I went to the window. The street was wet. It must have rained while I was there. My voice responded when needed. But there was a part of me that was slightly elsewhere, on a bookstore bench smelling of paper and chamomile. In a narrow corridor between two bodies that didn't touch, but came very close to making a decision. The following Thursday, I passed by the bookstore. On purpose. But slowly enough that if someone had been watching, I could have convinced them it was just the way I was going. The yellow light was there. Jazz, if I had the door open, probably too. I didn't go in. Not because I didn't want to, but because going in without a different reason seemed to say something very clear about what the whole week had been. And I was still grappling with that clarity. I kept walking. On Friday, when my friend asked me how I was, I said fine. She's known me for 6 years and looked at me with that same look she's had for 6 years. What happened? She asked. Nothing, I said. I went into a bookstore. She waited. He had a wife, I said. She continued waiting. Nothing happened, I said again. That's why it's strange. She said that those were sometimes the hardest things, the things that didn't happen, the things that remained on the brink. I didn't agree aloud, but she didn't need confirmation. That night I looked for the bookstore on Instagram. I found it. I followed it. I don't really know why, not expecting to find Nora there, just needing to maintain some connection with the place that, for 40-odd minutes, had been the most. But it's also true that I had passed by the store 3 times in the last 14 days and hadn't gone in. And this 4th time something was different. The attendant recognized me. She welcomed me back with the natural ease of someone who works in a place people like to revisit. She asked if I wanted tea again. I said yes. I sat on one of the benches. The other one was empty. I stood there for about 20 minutes with a book. I'd picked up from the nearest shelf a book of essays on domestic architecture, which wasn't exactly what I wanted to read, but had an interesting cover texture when the doorbell above the door rang. I didn't raise my eyes immediately. I don't know why I didn't get up. Maybe because I had learned not to turn every doorbell sound into an exercise in hope. But there was something in the way the attendant said, "Hi, Nora." That specific tone of someone who recognizes someone they consider part of the place's routine. I looked up. She was shaking the rain off her coat as she walked in. A different coat, navy blue this time, but the same earring. Just the left one. Small. She hadn't seen me yet. There was a second there where I could have kept my eyes on the book, where the decision to appear or not was still mine, where what would happen next was still open in a way that was both frightening and precious. Then she looked up and scanned the store with that look of someone checking where there's space. And he saw me. And she stood there for exactly 1 second longer than someone who sees a stranger. And I felt it in my chest before I knew what to do with the... She did all this with a calmness that I almost believed to be natural. But there was something very slightly restrained about her in her shoulders, in the way she didn't look at me again until she reached the counter. "So, you came back," she said, sitting down. Simple. "So I came back." We stared ahead for a second. "I came back too," she said. Several times. I didn't ask if she came back for me. There was no need to ask that. "I know what I was going to say that night," I said. She nodded. Slowly. Not like someone who already knew, like someone who was ready to listen and wanted to be careful with that readiness. "You don't have to say if you don't want to," she said. "It's not that I don't want to." Then I looked at my tea, at my hand around the cup. The ceramic was slightly irregular, handcrafted, the kind that heats unevenly so you always have one side that's warmer than the other. I was going to say that I don't know when was the last time I wanted to stay in a place because of a person, I said. Just like that, without knowing anything. Just because I was on the same side of the same shelf. She was quiet for a moment. "That's a lot," she said. "I know. I'm not saying it's too much." I looked at her. She was looking back at me with that same attention I'd felt weeks ago. Complete, careful, with no rush to solve anything. My name was Nora, she said, as if we were starting over from a different place. I know, I said. I heard the receptionist call you. I know you heard, she smiled. You changed a little when you heard. I wanted to ask what she meant by that. How it had become visible. What she had seen that I hadn't controlled. But there was also something comforting in knowing that it had been visible, that I wasn't the only one in this state, on one side, without reciprocity. What do you want to call it? She asked afterwards. I don't know if it needs a name. Probably not. She looked out the window. But I have my number on my cell phone if you want to write it down. He said it in a very direct and quiet way, as if it were just available information, not a substantial offer. But it had weight. And the two of us. Then I deleted Bookstore, because it seemed redundant in a way that made me smile at the screen. We stayed there until it closed again. We didn't resolve anything major. We didn't make any plans. We talked the way people talk when they're actually doing something else, learning each other's rhythm. How someone pauses mid-sentence. How someone laughs before the joke is finished, where a person's eyes go when they're not looking for anything specific. When the attendant said she was closing, we left together this time. On the sidewalk, she pulled up the hood of her coat because it had started raining again, that fine Portland drizzle that doesn't exactly soak you. It just accumulates without you noticing until suddenly you're completely drenched. Text me when you get home, she said. Don't text me if you don't want to. Text me when you arrive. I said I would send it. She went. Opposite direction. I walked 3 blocks before realizing I was smiling, not in a way that needed a big reason. The kind of smile that happens when something that was stuck starts moving again. When the body understands before the mind that something has changed. I sent a message when I arrived. She replied in 2 minutes. Just, good. I put my phone on the counter. I looked out the wet window. I thought about the blue book I had put back on the shelf on my first visit. I thought maybe I would pick it up next time. That there was something right about leaving something to pick up. There was a new message. There is a poetry reading here on Thursday. Would you come? I held my phone in my hand for a second. I thought about everything that the word yes would set in motion. I thought that sometimes you go into a place just to warm up and end up. And subscribe, because the next story begins where this one ends. In the moment before replying, if you're still here, there's a story waiting for you. About what happens when you answer, when you go. When the bookstore door opens for the 3rd time and you can no longer pretend it's a coincidence. If that's still with you, it begins now.